Before I talk about Cuba's history, we must first know its geography and location in the world. Cuba is an island located in the Northern American continent of the Caribbean Sea, just south of the state of Florida in the United States of America. It is the eighth largest island country in the world and has a tropical savanna climate with dry seasons from November to April and wet rainy seasons from May to October. The first human settlers of Cuba are theorized to have arrived approximately in the 4th millennium BC or 4000 BC, the beginning of the Bronze Age in the Old World, which is the main accepted theory of today. But there is the possibility that the first human settlers could have arrived during the Ice Age, as newly discovered evidence in New Mexico White Sands National Park where preserved Ice Age footprints can be found dating back to 23,000 BC. That means the American continent was settled during the peak of the Ice Age, last glacial maximum, which was 24,000 BC to 16,000 BC, which contradicts the accepted theory that the first humans arrived in America around 14,000 BC, when the ice sheets started to melt. The most accepted theory of how humans arrived in Northern America was via land that existed during the Ice Age between Asia and America called the Beringa Land Bridge, which is now the modern-day Bering Strait separating Russia from Alaska or Asia from North America. This land bridge existed as ocean levels which were much more lower due to the large ice sheets that existed during the Ice Age. Since ocean levels were much more lower, many islands that today we know, such as the Bahamas and Cuba, were larger in landmass size, and there is a possibility that the Bahamas was connected to Florida with the mainland and Cuba, which would have been a land bridge for Ice Age hunter-gatherers to travel through. I mention this possibility as archaeologists have found human evidence in South America as far back as 20,000 BC in Brazil, where they found human-made ornaments made from giant slot bones. The reason it is accepted that the first humans arrived in Cuba in 4000 BC is that archaeologists still haven't found older remains that are older than the current archaeological evidence, which is Livisa, which dates to 3100 BC. What we know of pre-Columbian Cuba and its native mainly come from accounts of Europeans and Spanish explorers and conquerors who were the first outsiders to arrive and document Cuba and its people. We also know more about pre-Columbian Cuba with modern-day archaeological studies of Cuba. Cuba, or Cubasnan, as the natives called it, was inhabited by the Gunanhatabe, Sinabe, and the Taino. They were short and muscular with straight black hair and copper-colored skin. There is little evidence of these natives to be warmongering. For the most part, they were peaceful people living off the land. The Gunahadabe, which is the name given to them, was not the term that the population identified as, but most likely an ethnic name given to them by the Spaniards when trying to communicate with them. The Gunahatabe were descendants of the original people who came to Cuba, who were living mainly on the western side of Cuba by the time Christopher Columbus arrived. Previously, with archaeological evidence, we know they lived on the entire island, but later were forced to move with the arrival of new native settlers such as the Taino and Siboney, who came from the eastern Caribbean islands. These people were hunter-gatherers, spending their time fishing, hunting, and gathering natural food in the environment. Their language or culture are unknown. The Spanish described them as cave-dwelling people. Whether that was false or true cannot be proven or disproven. The Siboney became at a time the most numerous on the island of Cuba when they arrived in Cuba and made the Guanahatabey people move westwards. They inhabited the central part of the island. Their culture and language are part of the Arakan culture group, which is the most widespread in South America. And some Arakan languages are still spoken today in Brazil, Suriname, Peru, Guyana, and Colombia. The name Siboney comes from the Arak term for cave dweller, and many of the Cuban Siboney appear to have lived in caves due to their Arakan culture that the Taino also have. They are sometimes referred to as Western Taino, while the Taino of the East are sometimes called Eastern Taino or Classic Taino. The Siboney lived a hunter-gathering life and were quite dominant on the island until 1450 AD, when quite ironically the Eastern Taino peoples started migrating west, dominating the Siboney people and becoming the dominant tribes of Cuba, just like how the Guanahatabey were dominated by the Siboney, so were the Siboney by the Eastern Taino people. By the time Columbus arrived, the Siboney culture was already dying out, which leads us to the Taino people. The Taino people were also Arawak in culture and language, such as the Siboney, came from the Amazon basin and migrated and settled through the Caribbean islands until they arrived at the shores of Cubanasnac around 1200 AD. Taino society was a lot more complex than the previous Cuban inhabitants. They were skilled in agriculture, harvesting tobacco, cotton, peppers, beans, squash, and the yuca root, which they baked and used to make cassava bread. They also ate maize and sweet potatoes, were skilled in fishing and canoeing. They made alcoholic beverages called chicha, made from corn. They governed themselves in chiefdoms, and their society was split into two classes, naborias, commoners, and nitanos, nobles. The chiefs were the leaders of Taino society, and they were called caquicos, if I pronounce it correctly. Taino had a matrilineal society, which means social status passed through the female lines, and descent was looked through by their mothers, not fathers. Taino houses were made from logs and poles with thatched roofs. Men were men wore loincloths, women wore aprons of cotton or palm fibers. Both sexes painted themselves on special occasions, and they wore earrings, nose rings, and necklaces, which were sometimes made of gold. The Taino also made pottery, baskets, and implements of stone and wood. A favorite form of pastime for them was a ball game, played on rectangular courts called beiti. The Taino had an elaborate system of religious beliefs and rituals that involved the worship of spirits or ancestors called zemis, utilizing carved representations. Overall, the total population ranged as high as 600,000. However, the actual total was probably about 75,000, but even then that's just speculation, as natives nor the Spanish made a population survey of the island. Overall life went peacefully for the most part for the natives of Cuba. Your average native most likely woke up with his lonely family beside him in his little hut, preparing his day, either fishing or farming to help his community and family to get by.